Well, good morning, everybody. I want to share with you a photo of my father, and you'll see this photo here. He's the individual in the white cap. This is the only photo he has of him as a young child. And this is a stark contrast to the over 18,000 photos I have of my 1.5-year-old son. And the reason why this is the only photo that my father has is that he experienced war and conflict at a very young age in the country of Korea. In fact, when he was only 3 years old, he remembers when communist soldiers came to his door knocking, looking for his father, who was a reporter at that time. Now, during the war, media personnel were the first people that the communists were looking for. And so my dad remembers opening the door and the soldiers pushing him aside, going upstairs, finding my grandfather, pulling him out of the house, and my father never saw his father again. Now, a few years after that, my grandmother became really, really sick, and she actually became a Christian because American missionaries were going to Korea at that time. She heard the gospel, she became a believer, and she really instilled in my father a faith that really sustains my father to this day. But when my father was just 7 years old, a few years after he saw his father taken away, his mom got really sick and she passed away. And so my father became orphaned at the young age of 7. Now, when he was in Korea, Korea was extremely poor at that time. He didn't know how he was going to sustain himself, but the one thing he did want to do was actually to immigrate to the United States of America, where he felt like he wasn't going to be confined by his poverty and where he could become anything that he wanted. Now, he didn't know how he was going to come here. All he knew was that he wanted to eventually make it to this country. Now, one thing he became really good at when he was in high school was fixing cars. And so in high school and right after high school, he actually entered a national car repair competition where he won first place. And he was so good that one of the judges noticed him and said, "Hey, I'm going to go to the United States of America. Do you want to come with me?" And so this was his golden ticket to actually come to the U.S. Now, when he came here, he actually started working at Ford Motor Company, and he eventually wanted to open up his own business, which he eventually did. And now he has his own car mechanic shop in downtown Philadelphia. So I always tell people, if you ever have car issues in Philly and your car breaks down, just call my dad, because he's going to know what to do. And so the story of migration, the story of experiencing war and suffering of my father is something that I think is unique to our family, but it's not unique to actually what's happening to millions of people around this world. In fact, right now, we are experiencing the world's worst migration crisis since World War II. There's around 65 million people who have been forced to flee from their homes to go to another country in safety, and this is the highest number of people who have been forcibly displaced since numbers were ever recorded. Now, many of these individuals are fleeing, looking for safety. They're fleeing war and conflict back in their home countries. And if you combine the numbers, actually, of people who are displaced, it's greater than the populations of Canada, New Zealand, and Australia combined. So imagine the people groups who are actually not having a home, and these are individuals who actually make up greater populations than some of these countries around the world. A few years ago, I actually went to Jordan, which is one of the countries that are hosting the largest number of refugees. In fact, when you look at the country of Jordan, it's estimated that 15 to 20% of their population is made up of refugees. Now imagine here in the United States if there was a war in our own country, imagine in the United States if Canada had erupted into war and Mexico had erupted into war, and the entire population of Canada and a third of the population of Mexico emptied themselves into the United States of America within the span of 5 years. That's exactly what Jordan is going through right now. And in fact, Syria is actually the country in which there's been such significant conflict that many of the refugees that are coming into Jordan are actually coming from the country of Syria. Now, what's interesting about Syria is that before the Syrian conflict, Syria was really stable. In fact, it was the country that hosted the second largest number of refugees. Refugees from Palestine and Iraq and other places had actually gone into Syria to seek safety and security. But within the span of a few years, Syria has actually become the country that is producing the largest number of refugees. So they became the second largest refugee hosting country to the country that is producing the largest number of refugees. When I went to Jordan a few years ago, like I mentioned, I actually went to visit a refugee camp in which many of these individuals were actually fleeing into. Now, when I went into this camp, the first thing I noticed about this community was that it was in the middle of a wasteland. I had to drive about 2 to 3 hours from Amman, Jordan, to actually get into this area. And the first thing I did when I went there was actually meet with some refugees who are living in these really dire conditions. And what was really fascinating to me about some of these conversations is that, first of all, many of these refugees never wanted to become refugees. They had stable careers, they had a really nice life in Syria. They never thought that conflict would impact them. But secondly, what I realized is that this area of Jordan that they're living in is nothing like what they experienced in Syria. If you look at this photo, you'll see that it is a complete wasteland. It's all desert, there's no vegetation. But in Syria, many of the Syrian refugees that I had met with talked about the fact that they used to be farmers and their kids would go out in parks and in green areas, something that we're probably all used to here as Americans, but it's something that they were not actually used to at all in Jordan, where they were confined to these 6x10 tents, living in an existence where they were depending on international organizations for their daily sustenance. But when we talk about the refugees, it's really important to understand some of the numbers. But the refugee crisis is not just about the millions, it's ultimately about the one individual refugee, about the one individual family that is impacted by war and conflict. The Washington Post did a series of documentaries where they actually showcase some of these individuals. And I want to introduce you to 2 individual Syrian refugees and share with you some of their stories. The first is Abdul Rahman Ahmad. He is 104 years old. He said that he hasn't had teeth for 30 years because his wife kissed him out with all of her kisses. He has dozens of grandchildren, and what's so fascinating about his story is he said that he never thought in his over 100 years of life that he would ever leave Syria. In fact, he remembers being in Syria and going through the Ottoman Empire and actually experiencing the war between, in Israel and the Iraqi war. And he's always stayed in Syria because that was what he was comfortable with and what he knew, what was his home. And he says he remembers farming chickpeas and lentils and beans. But when the Syrian conflict happened, he fled into Jordan in a wheelchair, confined and disabled, and he eventually made it to Jordan. And he's there with his entire family. And what's striking about his story is that over 100 years of him living in Syria, he's probably going to live the last years of his life never actually going back to the home that he called home for about 100 years. Now, the next individual that I want to introduce you to is Hooda Caliph. Now, she is a woman in her mid-30s, and she has 3 children. She remembers pleading with her husband to not actually go out and fight in the Syrian conflict. But her husband was so adamant with her that he needed to defend his people. And so the night that he went out and picked up in arms and actually was fighting against the Assad regime is when a bullet entered through his heart, and he passed away that evening. Now, what happened in that circumstance is that the husband's family went to Hooda and said, look, they know that your husband fought in the war, but they're going to actually come after you, so you have to take your children and go. So she crossed the border after 3 days riding on the backs of trucks and ended up in Jordan, where she is currently a refugee. Now, what's fascinating about her story is that her children were almost orphaned. She became a widow, and they became refugees. And these are the 3 categories of vulnerability that we hear about repeatedly in the Bible, right? It's widows and orphans and immigrants who are the people whom God repeatedly commands us as people of God to take particular concern for, because these were individuals that didn't have a parent, that didn't have a spouse, and that didn't have a community to actually care about them. Now, when we talk about the refugee crisis and the fact that there's millions of people who have been displaced from their homes, oftentimes the conversation revolves around, well, what can we do as not just Americans, but as followers of Christ to actually respond to this crisis? Well, when I went to Jordan, I think what's amazing about the story of refugees is that most all of them eventually want to go home. In fact, some of the refugees that I met actually had the keys to their homes in their hands because they knew that despite the conflict and despite the war, that they eventually were going to eventually make it back to Syria and back to their homes. And so they held the keys in their hands and said, you know, eventually I'm going to actually make it back to my place and to my community and my neighborhood despite what's happening in the war. But for a lot of refugees, they actually go to places like Jordan and Turkey, and they live there for an extended period of time. It's estimated that refugees, on average, live in a camp like the one I just showed you for 15 to 17 years. Imagine living in a community like that for over a decade, where your children have to go to school and where you have to sustain yourself for a span of 15 to 17 years. But it was what has consumed the discussion, especially right here in the United States of America and even in Europe, is the small number of refugees that are coming into our communities and how we as a community should respond to these numbers. Now, last year, the United States of America received around 85,000 refugees. These were individuals who came from over 40 countries and came into the United States of America. I live in the city of Baltimore, where I actually got to know one of these individuals, and his name is Mustafa. He is someone who is 21 years old and came into the US because he actually remembers being a high school student, and he was at a medical appointment. But when he was at his medical appointment, a bomb dropped on his high school, and 3 of his closest friends passed away. Now, when he came to Baltimore, he was actually by himself because the rest of his family remained in Turkey, and he struggled with dealing with the fact that he was the only survivor among all of his friends who actually survived from the Syrian conflict. And so when he was sharing his story with me, what was striking to me was that he grew up culturally Muslim, but he said, don't call me Muslim anymore, because the God that I used to believe in is a God that didn't save my friends from death. And so even now, as I was talking with him, I realized he is going to struggle with this idea of trauma and of war for a significant period of time. But as I got to know Mustafa, I realized this is an individual who has taught me so much about resilience and about thriving in spite of challenges and difficulties. But the desire that I have to get to know Mustafa and individuals like him is something that I think has been controversial in the United States of America. In fact, just a few years ago at World Relief, where I work, we actually did a survey where we actually asked Christian pastors all across this country, what is a sense that your church has about the refugees that are coming into our communities? And what we found is that 44% of the pastors that we surveyed said that there is a real sense of fear around immigrants and refugees like Mustafa who are coming into our communities. And I believe this is not just a challenge for us as Americans to grapple with, but this is fundamentally a challenge for us as followers of Christ in understanding, well, what does the Bible actually have to say about how we as followers of Christ are to respond to the refugee crisis? There are a couple things that I want to note to you about what I found in reading the scriptures around the issue of migration. The first is that when you read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, almost every single major biblical character was an immigrant at one point or another. And in fact, their migration experience fundamentally shaped how they experienced God. The first immigrant that I can actually think about in scriptures is Abraham. He is the father of our faith. And when God called him to leave his homeland and to go to another land that God would show him, Abraham had no idea where he was going. He also didn't know what he was going to find when he got there. All he knew was that God was calling him to leave everything that was comfortable to him and to go to another land that God would show him. Another person that we think about as an immigrant is Joseph. He was someone who was sold into slavery by his brothers. He is someone who was a biblical victim of human trafficking because he was enslaved for many, many years. He crossed borders as a slave, and eventually he became the right-hand man to Pharaoh, and it was in that position that he saved his people from famine. But we also see in the story of Ruth, she was a Moabite woman who followed her mother-in-law into the gleaning fields, where she became a migrant worker. And it was when she was a migrant farm worker actually gleaning barley and wheat from the fields that Boaz noticed her as a woman of noble character, and that's what led to their marriage in the story of Ruth. But perhaps the greatest refugee of all was Jesus himself. He was someone who literally fled the wrath of King Herod. Mary and Joseph had to take baby Jesus into Egypt in order to save his life. Now, Jesus was someone who was a Middle Eastern single man, and he fits the category of the people that we want to keep out of our country. And so my question to all of us is, if Jesus were born today as a Middle Eastern refugee, would we even welcome him into our communities? Now, the word for immigrant, or ger, is actually mentioned 92 times in the Old Testament alone. Now, earlier today, the worship leader read from Deuteronomy 10, which speaks to God's heart for immigrants and orphans and widows. But the idea of God's concern for widows and orphans and immigrants is something that's repeated throughout the Old Testament. It says, for example, in Malachi 3:5, I will be quick to testify against those who defraud laborers of their wages, who oppress the widows and the fatherless, and deprive aliens of justice. It says in Psalm 146:9, the Lord watches over the alien and sustains the fatherless and the widow. And so you see this repeated commandment in the Old Testament that the people of God were supposed to be the people that cared for these particularly vulnerable individuals. But this idea of hospitality and of loving the stranger is repeated in the New Testament as well. Many of us know the story of the Good Samaritan, but what's unique about that story is that the Samaritan is someone of a reviled religion, of a reviled nationality, and yet he is the individual that Jesus lifts up and says that this is the person whom you are to emulate, because this is actually the one who showed mercy to the person beat up along the side of the road. But the idea of Christian hospitality is not just limited to that. In fact, Christian hospitality is philoxenia, or love of a stranger. Love of a stranger. Now, we as Americans, we're really good at hospitality, right? And we've turned hospitality into the latest image on our Pinterest boards. It's us having an amazing, roasted turkey and the best macaroni and cheese and inviting our friends and family over for an amazing meal. And that is a good form of hospitality, but that's not necessarily a biblical form of hospitality. Because what Jesus challenges us to do is not just to invite our friends and family to the table of God, but the strangers and even our enemies to the table of God. I know in my experience in getting to know refugees in my community in Baltimore, that more than me giving to them, I feel like I've received more from them and through their stories, and my faith has grown in God because of my experience with refugees. I got to know an Iranian refugee family a few years ago, and I've had some of the best Persian food I've ever had in my life. And as I've gotten to know Syrian refugee families over the past few years, they've been even more hospitable to me than even some of the many American friends that I've had, as they've invited me over for tea and coffee in their homes, even with the limited resources that they have. Now, much of the conversation around refugees in our country has really involved a sense of fear. And I think fear has a role to play because it helps us determine what's safe for us to do and what's safe for us not to do. But if fear becomes our dominant response in the refugee crisis, I believe we will become crippled from participating in the mission of God. And the reason I say that is because I believe people are moving from one place to another so that people who have never heard the gospel can hear the gospel for the very first time. We have worked for a church in Nashville for many, many years where they started picking up Bhutanese refugees at the airport. Now, Bhutanese refugees are individuals who are predominantly Buddhist. And after one Sunday service in which they were shown a Jesus video, a few weeks after that, they baptized over 70 Bhutanese refugees into the family of God. Now, this was an incredible testament, not just to the work of this church in welcoming these refugees, but the fact that God is doing something through the refugee community in which we're seeing people who have never heard the gospel before hear the gospel for the very first time. Just recently, I heard of Iraqi and Syrian refugees who have had dreams about Jesus and who actually go into their local church and are encountering Jesus and the gospel for the very first time. Syrian refugees, individuals coming from Bhutan, people are coming to know Christ for the very first time in the United States of America, are coming from areas where the gospel and the church is not prevalent. In Syria and in Bhutan and many of these other countries, the church is extremely limited. In fact, many of these individuals have never heard the gospel before. But it says in Acts 17 that from all nations, God created many nations. And he actually placed them in areas so that he could actually reach out for them and perhaps find them. It is our responsibility as followers of Christ not to allow fear to cripple us from building relationships with people who are different than us. In fact, if we as a church welcome and love the very people the world wants us to hate, we will advance the mission of God. A few years ago, when I was in Jordan, I actually met a Jordanian pastor, and what he said to me is, I've prayed for revival in Jordan for 5 to 10 years. I just didn't know how it was going to happen. But since the refugee crisis happened, I've had Syrian refugees coming into my community in Jordan and hearing the gospel for the very first time. He said that God is answering his prayer for revival in the Middle East through the refugee crisis because refugees are coming into this church and transforming the life of this church. And then he asked me, why is this controversial in the United States of America? And why is it that followers of Christ are the ones that are seemingly the most anti-refugee? Don't they see this as an incredible missional opportunity to share the gospel with people who have never heard it before? And I completely agree with him. Oftentimes, we think about our response to the refugee crisis as a matter of politics or as a matter of economics, but I believe our response to the refugee crisis is fundamentally a matter of our faith. Migration is not just changing the face of our country, it is literally changing the face of Christianity. And if we as a community of Christ build up walls, and do not want to enter into relationships with these very people who have suffered a lot, I believe we will miss out on the incredible things that God is doing to bring people to know himself. And he's using us and giving us an opportunity as students and as colleagues and brothers and sisters of Christ to be a part of this great mission that God is doing. Now, many of you may be asking, I'm just a college student, so what can I do? There is so much that you guys can do. You have so many resources and so much time on your hands to actually get involved. The first thing I would say is we need to change the conversation around refugees. So much of the narrative has been around fear, but I believe we have an opportunity to actually talk about refugees as individuals made in the image of God. And we at World Relief have created a text messaging system where if you text the word refugee to 41411, we can actually send you information about ways that you can get involved on your campus. So again, it's texting the word refugee to 41411. But also, I would ask you to activate your campuses. I think this week is a great week to start off, but use your voices, speak up to your elected officials, let them know that you as a body of believers and a body of students actually care about the refugee crisis. Because ultimately, when we talk about refugees and people who've been displaced, it's not about creating just a place to live, but it's ultimately about creating a place to belong. I want to share with you a video of the incredible work that we've seen of one local church that actually decided to say yes to welcoming refugees and the transformative experience that they had in doing so.